that sometimes. So you worked with them over a period of months, rewriting and rewriting and rewriting on a book that you'd already worked on a long time, and that it was obviously in good shape. I passed it on to Linda, and still there was work to be done, big work to be done. There's always big work to be done with Linda. Either she's got exceptionally slow writers, or say by slow, I don't mean in terms of time, I mean in terms of intelligence, or she's just really, and that's what she is, she's an editor who really digs into it. So then the book was going to come out, and then at what point did you say to your husband, honey,
here's what we're doing.
gas up the car?
So why the 7-month, 40,000-mile book tour? Well, first of all, when it takes 13 years to achieve a dream, and the reason why I said this is a very emotional day for me is it really was a dream, and I think Nancy said that she played a small role and something about an iceberg. No. This was my dream ever since I was 5 years old, and I remember my kindergarten teacher binding each of our stories in wallpaper. We got to choose our own wallpaper. My mother, luckily I praised her about the editing, but now I can tell you that she lost that, and it is a bitter, bitter memory. But I can still see the story and the pictures that I drew. I wanted to be a writer since at least I was 5, and it wasn't happening. It wasn't happening in the way that I wanted, and the world had changed very much in that decade, and a lot of people were, self-publishing, and the word we don't really talk about in beautiful bookstores like that had become a viable path, and I know writers for whom it's worked well, but for me, it was never going to work well, because this is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to get to meet people like you, and get to be in a bookstore, and so I had no other options, and yet I could not imagine writing a 9th novel. And the 7th novel, in fact, had been turned down in just the way Nancy described, right at the very top of Penguin Putnam, the publisher herself. God love her. I think she has published tons of brilliant people, but she didn't find me that way, and she herself had turned down the 7th novel. And it wasn't happening, and that's when Nancy stepped in, and I still don't know. What would have happened if it hadn't gone that way, and if our paths hadn't crossed, and I hadn't discovered Scent of Rain and Lightning, because the reason it was so easy to send on those lists from DL was because it was just honest. I had loved the book, and it was neat to see that other people were including it on their best of lists too. So why the 7th-month book tour? When something takes on a life of its own in that way, it becomes a dream that you don't know if you'll ever get, you sort of feel like you want to give everything to it. And, after that many years of feeling like, oh, I wish I had readers and I wish I could do this, it just made sense to do it in a kind of crazy way. Sometimes the crazy makes sense. And so, we didn't just gas up the car. We actually traded in our 2 cars so we could have a 4-wheel drive that would handle Denver in February. We got as far west as Denver right after the book came out. We rented out our house. We have our 2 kids back there, and we are car schooling them. And we visited about 160, 180 bookstores so far. And
Whenever I say that to somebody, they say, I didn't know there were still 160. There
are about 1,900 independent bookstores in this country, and there are more opening, like this one. For the last 3 years, the openings have been up, and I'm here to tell you that, no, we don't always get a crowd this wonderfully robust, but that's okay. Sometimes a 5-person event can be awfully fun too. But we have seen crowds like this for certain bookstores, not because of me, because I'm completely unknown, but just because the bookstores have really thriving event lives, as Mysteryscape, is in the process of doing so.
I'd just like you to speak to the fact, Jenny, before she was ever published, started a program called Take Your Kid to the Bookstore, a national program, and was doing these kinds of tours every summer. Tell them all about that.
Just for 2 weeks, so not quite as crazy. But we have not been in our home now for 4.5 months, which is a little strange and hard on my daughter. But yes, take your child to a bookstore day. My husband is holding up bookmarks. I love bookstores, as I told you. That's my daughter on the cover who is back there on the bookmark. She's reading right there. I was taking the kids to bookstores every week for story hour and feeling like, wow, this is magical. And yes, whoever, the 160, the people who say, I'm surprised there are 160, there's a thriving bookstore scene, and I think probably more thriving than it's been since the 70s maybe. But not everybody knows about it, and not everybody knows what a magic experience it is when a child enters a bookstore. And libraries are wonderful too. Libraries were my places of shelter as a child. But there's something with a bookstore where you actually take that book home with you and it becomes a part of yourself. So we're hoping to become a nonprofit. We actually have a board now, and one of the members, who's much smarter than I am about almost anything, is working to make us a nonprofit. And when we do, we hope to have field trips for children and school trips so that kids can come to a bookstore and buy a book.
And so did they? And they didn't offer a tour for Virgin or Scent. And what I was told, and which is funny because those two books did much better than any of my other books had ever done. But even after they were doing well, particularly Scent, there was no talk of a tour. And what I was told was that then, I think it's changed even now, if they're going to do a tour, they'll do it either for the really top bestsellers or for brand new authors that they want to introduce to bookstores. And now I suspect, I don't know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're doing. But I will say that one of the things about those old book tours that I discovered, they were funny because you'd be sent to bookstores, you couldn't figure out why you were sent there. And maybe you'd be sent to Denver and you'd be sent to the Tattered Cover, but there were at the time I think 3 mystery bookstores in the area, but maybe they didn't want to send you to the mystery bookstores, and why not? Or they'd sent you. I remember one time being sent to an independent bookstore in Milwaukee where the only reason I had a crowd was that the staff came over and sat in the chairs. At some point I discovered that they were, those tours, that kind of tour in those days was not about us. In a way it wasn't even about our books. It was about 2 or 3 different things. One was the sales department was the one that dictated where you went. And you went where their best stores were. And you went because they'd given a list of authors who were available to those stores, and stores that for some reason picked you. And so it didn't mean, well, so anyway, that's one of the reasons. When the big box stores came in, there was a lot of resistance to sending us to independent bookstores. We had to fight to continue to go to independent bookstores because Barnes & Noble and Borders would object. They didn't want us to go to independent bookstores. And let's see, what else? Just that it also wasn't about the appearances. It kind of didn't matter from the publisher's point of view, although they would be pleased to hear you'd had 300 people. If you only had 2, but you got good media, that's what they really took you there for. And it was a little easier in those days to get media, to get a little TV and a little radio and a little newspaper. And I personally benefited, particularly the year I was president of National Sisters in Crime, because that's when Women in Mysteries, that was new, and it gave me something to talk about. Fiction is hard to sell to the media, and hard to get interviews for, and nonfiction is much better, and that's about the closest I could get to talking about nonfiction. Mysteries are also, don't you think, really hard to talk about when you're being interviewed, because you can't give anything away. You can't even kind of tell what it's about in a way, because what it's about can give away what it is too. So
A woman wakes up.
How long
were you on tour for, Nancy? When they did it for you, how would it work?
Well, sometimes I'd be gone as long as 3 weeks, but they would maybe send me home once. There would always be one night where I'd be someplace and I'd just feel like, why am I doing this meaningless thing? And I just start to cry and feel very sorry for myself while I had room service. Then they got desperate. They started sending us in pairs and in groups. And Pocket sent all the mystery writers out like that one year, and they paired me with Jeremiah Healy, who is one of the characters of the mystery world. And Jerry and I were on tour together for 2 weeks. That was a hoot. And I don't think it made a bit of a difference to our sales. And it's really hard, or it was in those days, to judge how you were doing. And I think I only had 2 instances of thinking that touring actually in that way helped. I mean, not that it didn't, just that I couldn't, nobody had data. And one was in Denver, I hit the bestseller list for 1 week, and that was because I had a good deal more media than I'd ever had. That was it. And the same thing happened in LA. And again, it was because there was a lot of media at that particular time, which I think must have meant that there were no other bigger writers in town. So, I mean, it's just very hard to judge. And when you go around, I think you at least know how each store's doing, but it's still.
But see, I do have a lot of hesitations with that model. We were out for 3 weeks and you were flying.
Right.
So, and what you said about the 4 other mystery bookstores, so they flew you to Tattered Cover, which is a wonderful place, but there was a whole, constellation of bookstores around there, and the advantage to driving and doing it in this crazy way is that we can literally stop, every 5 miles if we want to. And for me, I mean, Nancy made the bestseller list and all that because there was media attention, and there has been some of this actually. The book did make the SIBA, which is the Southern International Booksellers Association bestseller list the week I was in the South, and so there was a little bit of that. But for me, I think I felt as if it weren't so much about book sales, but about connecting with the people who, maybe would, not even about this first book, but maybe take a career from the first book and try to build it as it, grows or something.
I think that's really true. They're not going to forget Judy. And particularly, if you don't take as long as I do to bring a book out.
Let's not talk about that. I have to change it from Idaho.
Let's take a second. I don't even know what time it is, so let's take a second here to see whether you have any questions at this point.